Now it's time to introduce our speaker. Gillian, I worked with Gillian at the museum. She's spent 13 years or more as a volunteer guide at the museum, and she's a member of the speakers at the museum and recently has joined the Naval Historical Society as a speaker. She's done a speaker before this one today. She has a direct connection to Sydney, having lost an uncle on the ship. She's also been heavily involved in the identification of the unknown servicemen for many years and has a special interest in all things Navy and maritime. Before all of this, she had a successful sales career at CSR. We all look forward to the announcement, which we probably all know about on Friday, the 80th anniversary. This presentation will give you an appreciation of the work that's been done to identify the unknown servicemen, and we'll all just have to wait until Friday to find out what that announcement is all about. So over to you, Gillian.
Thank you very much, Noel. I'll just now, many of you would be aware of the publicity that is surrounding the unknown servicemen. I have no comment to make about that today. What we're here to talk about is the journey of this man from when he was buried on Christmas Island to the finding of the grave and all the scientific forensic work that has gone in, plus persistence by a number of people to help identify relatives and that can be DNA tested. The tragic thing about the loss of HMAS Sydney 79, almost 80 years ago, was that the loss of her 645 crew represented 32% of the Royal Navy, Australian Navy losses in World War II. And these are the things that we will cover in this, and I will be glad to take questions about this presentation at the end. So let's look very briefly at the battle, in case any of you hadn't heard the battle presentation that Noel and I did previously for the NHSA. This will be reasonably brief. Let's look at Sydney. We can see all of her weaponry here. A Leander class modified cruiser, very good looking, handsome ship. She had a speed of 32.5 knots, and very important in this scenario is her gun range. And she had all the things that you would expect a warship to have, significant weaponry, hull plating of 1 inch, and armour over all of her machinery spaces. But there was a weakness identified in her design by her first commanding officer, and that weakness was her high-angle control tower and her gun director. There were no redundant systems for these. These are high up above the bridge. And of course, when they were taken out, it meant the guns would have to revert to local control, which would significantly impede her gunnery efficiency. Let's look at the other protagonist in this story, HSK Cormoran. She was an auxiliary cruiser, a Hilfskreuzer, and had been ex-Steiermark, a Hamburg American Line freighter. You can see her here as Steiermark, and after she was converted to Cormoran, you can see there's a reduction in the number of Samson posts and some changes here to her superstructure and also some of her hull structure. But look at the difference in size between Cormoran and Sydney. She's only 8,700 tonnes. She only has a speed of 18 knots, sorry. And her gunnery, yes, was significant, but most of them were World War I guns. And her gunnery range was less than half of Sydney's. And we know that she sought targets of opportunity, was instructed by the German High Command to avoid contact with Allied warships. However, if she was to run across Allied warships, every means at her disposal was to be used to fight the warship and dispose of that warship. And she regularly changed her disguise by the use of different paint jobs, fake funnels, fake canvas boards, particle board, fake walls, etc. And let's look at Cormoran's concealed gunnery. She's got 6-inch guns, numerous 6-inch guns concealed by drop-down panels in the hull. The 20mm guns here and here would pop up on counterweights. Same here with the 15-centimetre gun on her cargo hatch. The cargo hatch would move away and these guns would come up. And she also had other weapons up near her bridge and superstructure. So she was very much a wolf in sheep's clothing, and to the untrained eye, she would just look like an unassuming merchantman. So what was the lead up to the battle off West Australia on that day, the 19th of November 1941? Sydney had sighted Cormoran at roughly 15:55 in the afternoon. She closed and was signalling by lamps and flags. NNJ, what ship are you? But Cormoran doesn't understand. Sydney uses plain language. Once again asks the question. Cormoran replies. She says, Straat Malacca, a Dutch freighter. However, Captain Burnett would know that Straat Malacca was not on Sydney's plot, but he also knew that this wasn't necessarily an exact science, as he had been involved in plotting when he worked at Naval Headquarters. Cormoran at 17:03 and 17:05 sends out a double Q system, a signal. This is a signal that you would send out if you were a freighter being attacked by an armed merchant cruiser. So this is the incorrect signal to send out. Sydney says, where are you bound? Cormoran, Batavia. What cargo? Peace goods. All the time, Sydney is being drawn closer and closer to Cormoran. Finally, Sydney asks, Hoist IK, Indigo Kilo, what is your secret identification code? Cormoran, of course, does not have this. We know that the secret code for Straat Malacca was IIKP, but Cormoran does not have this. The jig is up. Detmers, the commanding officer of Cormoran, decamouflages in less than 10 seconds and opens fire on Sydney, who by this time is less than 1,000 yards away. Both ships eventually open fire on each other. Sydney's first salvo goes over Cormoran, but Cormoran had a very detailed gunnery strategy in place, and her initial salvos hit Sydney's bridge, taking out the command structure. The 4-inch guns on Sydney could not be manned through to rapid and accurate fire from Cormoran's other weapons. Every gun on Cormoran had a dedicated place to aim at on a suspect ship. And Cormoran's guns are hitting Sydney every 6 seconds and maintaining an incredibly high rate of fire. So you can see that Sydney is on fire here, but also she has scored some hits on Cormoran. But as a result of the incredibly accurate and consistent fire with Cormoran, A and B turrets on Sydney, here's A, here's B, never fire again. You can see B turret's roof is being blown off. She's on fire amidships because one of Cormoran's shells had hit her aircraft, which had been ready for takeoff but had not been flown off. So she was ablaze amidships. Cormoran then fires 2 torpedoes. One you can see striking Sydney here back from the bow. And we've still got X and Y turrets, both in local control on Sydney. X turret gets off a shell which strikes Cormoran's engine room and cripples her engines. During all of this, Sydney is getting repeated damage until ultimately she is seen to slowly steam away, blazing on fire down by the bow. Cormoran ultimately is abandoned because the fire from the engine room could not be contained, and she was scuttled with explosive charges after 300 of her crew were able to escape in lifeboats. This is a simulated picture of Sydney in her last moments. The sea state, unfortunately, was rising. She's weakened in the bow. She's a pepper pot of large holes. Water is coming in. Her electrical systems are debilitated and destroyed in many instances. Water is coming in every time she rolled, and ultimately she is overwhelmed by the sea state and goes down, taking anybody alive with her. This is what the Sydney crew looked like. This was taken just after the Battle of Cape Sparta. Hard to believe that all of these men could have disappeared so quickly and to an uncertain fate for many years. And there were no bodies or survivors found, only 2 life vests, 1 Carly float was found from Sydney on the scene, but unbelievably, not a body or a survivor. And this was the telegram that was sent out to families. My grandparents received this telegram only a few days later. You can imagine their dismay and shock, as for all the crew members of HMAS Sydney who received this telegram. And my uncle was barely 20, the average age of Sydney crew, 21. All young men stepping up to do big jobs, lives cut short. Why were there no survivors? This is some of the wreckage photo. Look at the ruined boats here from Sydney. You can see how they're damaged by shell fire. You can see a turret with a 6-inch shell hole here. You can see where the bow has broken off from Sydney as she plunged down through the dark depths. Her upturned bow is somehow in the region of 500 metres away from the main wreck site. Look at the holes in her hull, showing just part of the story of the damage that she suffered. And tragically, here we have a sea boot showing the damage of shrapnel caused. It was estimated that there was well in excess of 200,000 pieces of shrapnel raining down on the men of Sydney during that engagement. And here finally is Sydney's shattered bridge, very accurately destroyed by Cormoran's early fire. You can barely make out the compass binnacle here. So why were there no survivors? We know that the majority of men must have been injured in some way. Burns, overcome with smoke, inhalation of smoke, wounds, etc., going into the water. We know that 2/3 of Sydney's 645 crew were injured or dead in some way by the end of the action. The Cormoran's crew had reported that they saw sharks in the water. Now, if you've got bleeding, injured men in the water, the marine predators will be drawn to the groups. We know that the search did not begin until 5 days after Sydney was lost. And of course, without water, even the fittest man cannot survive longer than 5 days in the ocean. Of course, thirst would be their greatest killer, and you might be tempted to drink seawater, which leads to accelerated dehydration and delirium. And why is that? If you ingest seawater, it's got a significant salt content. The salt level in your body goes up, and all the cells immediately flush themselves out with water to try to rectify the balance of water versus salt, which of course then increases your dehydration, and your kidneys will then fail, and you are also lapsing into unconsciousness. The life belts at the time did not provide particularly good head support, and if someone lapsed into unconsciousness or indeed fell asleep, there was every chance that they could roll on their face and drown. Now, the interesting thing that there were no bodies on the surface, we know that decomposition sets in between 6 and 10 days after death, depending on the temperatures. The depth of water also is important. Where Sydney sank, it was 2,500 metres below the surface. This also influences the decomposition rates. So anybody that did come to the surface, the search was ended on the 29th. So therefore, it would be very unlikely that anything would ever even be found at any point. However, and this we come to the crux of the story. On the 6th of February, 1942, a body in a Carly float was seen by coast watchers drifting off Christmas Island. Now, Christmas Island is 1,800 kilometres northwest of the actual Sydney wreck site. And it was found over 2 months after Sydney had been lost. The body had no ID on it, no rings, no watches, no dog tags, no rank rank indication. There was a lot of marine growth on it that supported the story that had been in the water for some time. And the body was clad in a boiler suit. And there was also a shoe in the raft. That shoe did not match the body in the raft. So you can see Flying Fish Cove here, where the Carly float was seen to be floating. Now, the Carly floats were a cylinder of metal, an oval-shaped cylinder of metal that were covered in cork and would have also canvas covering. It had a timber slat and it would drop down and make possibly someone could stand on it or have some ability to sustain themselves. But these floats were not used by Allied merchant services. So we know that it was from a naval vessel. And you can see here, Sydney's got Carly floats on her stern when she was escorting Queen Elizabeth and Queen Mary when she was on convoy duty around the coast of Australia. Now, the Carly float that was discovered off Christmas Island was taken to Fremantle in 1942, but unfortunately for us, no record of it still exists. There is a Carly float on display at the Australian War Memorial that was found during the search for Sydney. And you can see the battle damage here. And also the timber slatted floor also has a shell hole through it. That is on display at the War Memorial. So what do we know about the body? The state of the body and its position were indicated by the design of the Carly float. We know that the parts of the body that were not exposed to the water were almost mummified by sun and salt, but the part of the body that was in contact with water was decomposed and had also been attacked by marine life, and also there was some damage to the body by birds, etc. It was the body of a white Caucasian male, and it was taken to the local hospital where the doctor did a post-mortem, but sadly there is no record of that post-mortem at the moment. It's not ever been discovered. The doctor commented on the dental structure of the body. This will be important later. And in February 42, the body was buried with full military honours in a specialised coffin because his body could not fit in a standard coffin because of the shape that he was more or less mummified in. And he was buried in the European cemetery. There was no time for a headstone, so there was only a mound of earth. In early March 42, the Japanese occupied the island and held it until the end of the war. But post-World War II, the gravesite was still obvious. It was known by locals, and indeed people did come to the gravesite and take photos. And one man who visited the site, who was working on Christmas Island, was a man called Brian O'Shaughnessy, whose photo will become important later on. But over the years, as is wont with Mother Nature, the site was worn down by wind and rain, and the exact position became lost in time. Now, in 1999, the joint standing committee from the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, after a very exhaustive inquiry into the loss of Sydney, recommended that an attempt be made to locate the grave and exhume the remains on Christmas Island, because they came to the conclusion that that body in that grave was most probably from a Sydney crewman. So in 2001, the Navy sent a team to the island. They knew from the mine manager's recollection where the rough site of the grave was. There was a phosphate mine on Christmas Island, and there was for a number of years. However, the cemetery by this stage was shockingly overgrown and in terrible condition. So they cleared the site and they laid out grids as best they could to the sites recalled by the mine manager, and used ground penetrating radar to see if there were any anomalies below the surface. 2 weeks was spent on that search, and unbelievably, over 40 cubic metres of soil were removed and sifted by hand. Sadly, no body was found. And at that stage, the Chief of Navy indicated no further action would be taken unless compelling new evidence came to light. So for many, that was a cause of anguish, because they firmly believed that the man in that grave was from Sydney and the grave had to be found. However, something significant was rediscovered in 2005 that had been in the Sydney archives. What was that? It was this grainy old photo that was taken in 1950 by Brian O'Shannessy. So we can see this headstone here, which was still very visible in a photograph taken in 2005, as well as this marker here, which is also seen here. So this was a revelation, this photograph. So John Perryman interviewed the witnesses, and one of them was a man called Say Kit Fu, whose father had been the cook for the mine manager, and he was aware of where the grave would be. So all the evidence was reviewed and another search was approved by Chief of Navy. So in 2006, a team went to the island, some of them from the previous team, but others who were specialists in this sort of thing, in body retrieval. And six test trenches were dug by hand. Every bit of soil was sifted. Sadly, nothing was found. And then almost at the end of their time, a test trench was dug between a very narrow space between two graves. And on the 30th of September 2006, a splinter of wood was found at 1.8 metres depth. Further digging revealed coffin nails and a tarsal bone down near your ankle. Then press studs were unearthed. More bones were discovered and measurements were taken over a 5-day period. Everything was recorded to within an inch of its life, and it also contained coffin wood, nails and brass eyelets in the grave. It was very important for the integrity of the bones to keep them intact, and they were wrapped in foil, including the soil that was around them. And finally, you could say that the grave of the unknown serviceman had been found. So what happens next? We have a drawing of the skeleton here. We know that it was a male because the pelvis was quite narrow. The arms were separated at the elbow joints here, and his forearms were positioned and hands were positioned under the body. There's numerous press studs. You can see the legend here, press studs and eyelets. You can see that there. And I said before, he was positioned in an unusual way in his custom-made coffin because of the position he was found in the Kali float. He had fractures to his ribs, which you can see here. So the position of the bones was very carefully recorded, and I've said wrapped in foil, and they were flown to the Shellshear Museum of Physical Anthropology at the Uni of Sydney. So pretty exciting stuff. So what did the scientific investigation of the body reveal? It revealed it was a male Caucasian between 22 and 31. How could they guess this year span? Well, they looked at his collarbone, and the epiphyseal plate on your collarbone only fuses after the age of 22 and is normally fused by your late 20s. So we know he was not younger than age 22. They knew by his femur that this was his height, between 168.2 centimetres and 187.8 centimetres. His bones indicated he was of quite slight build. He wasn't a muscle-bound rugby forward. And the bones on his right arm were more developed than his left, which indicated being right-handed. There was also a metal object embedded in his skull. We got details of that. There was a warping around the left side of his cranium where the bones were slightly crushed in, and there were also fracture lines running from that metal object in his skull. The dental quality that was commented on by the doctor all those years ago was found to be very high quality. There were caps, there were gold fillings, and he had a missing tooth on his upper right jaw, and the gap had been filled in by the teeth on either side. So they had grown crookedly across the gap that made his smile pattern quite unique. There were spinal compressions that indicated that the man had worked hard in his early life. And there were squatting facets on his tibio-talar joints. So in other words, he was had spent quite a bit of time in the squatting position, which is quite comfortable for people who get used to it, and it doesn't take a lot of energy to maintain that. You would use that position possibly in the bush. It's used up in Asia where furniture was not readily available. And in 2009, isotope testing was done on a fragment in Canada, and the oxygen and strontium levels were measured, and it indicated that he had consumed a high marine diet as a child, pointing to possibility that he was spent his early years in northern New South Wales or southern Queensland. And it was also found that the cause of death was probably from the lack of medical treatment following the skull injury. Because remember, he's gone in the water on the 19th of November and not seen again for several months. So he had absolutely no treatment for his wound in his head, or in fact, the fracture in his skull. So let's look at what we know from forensic ballistic examination of the metal object in his skull. You can see it here under a microscope, and you can also see the position on the frontal lobe of the skull, and you can see the fracture lines here. And note, this part of his skull is slightly stove in. It's 15 millimeters roughly in diameter. It is not from a small arms projectile, because metallurgical analysis shows us that there is no lead in that metal object. Neither was there nickel or copper. Now, the Japanese used nickel and copper in their shell, so it indicates it did not come from a Japanese projectile. However, what the elemental analysis did show was that it was consistent with hardened steels used by the Germans in their armour-piercing shells, because the Germans used manganese and silicon in their armour-piercing shells, and that was identified in the elemental analysis. So therefore, it's a large caliber weapon suitable or similar to what is used in a naval battle. But this shell fragment itself was not found to be a fatal wound. And we do know that death may not have been imminent due to the skull fracture. So he must have been alive for some days after he made it into the raft. But how did he sustain that skull fracture? It's thought that he was blown against a metal part of the ship, or blown down upon something metal, struck his head, and that is what created the fracture in his skull. It was definitely an impact injury. So once all of this information was put together, it led to the conclusion that the man was from HMAS Sydney II. And so he was given a proper burial on the 19th of November 2008 in the Geraldton War Cemetery. 2008 is the year that the Sydney wreck was discovered. And you can see the wording here about this man. And really, it is so sad to think that this individual, was damaged, and we didn't know much about him for some particular time. And you can see here that the headstone reads, a serviceman of the 1939-1945 war, HMAS Sydney, known unto God. Now, the Cole Commission of Inquiry that was set up directed that the fabric associated with the boiler suit that he was wearing be examined, and it was re-examined in 2019. The material under the press studs, as you can see here, was blue. But we know that the Navy did not wear blue overalls at that time. The studs were examined by the Australian National University and the AFP's Forensic and Data Centre. And what else was shown later on was that the press studs had the word CA and a space AU that stand for Car Australia, who made the press studs and eyelets for boiler suits at that time. Now, a boiler suit was worn by officers, commissioned and non-commissioned warrant officers who could hold a watchkeeping certificate. But it was ultimately found that the evidence from the fabric was inconclusive. So then we have to move to try to identify this man. 330 dental records were available. No match showed the similar dental patterns. I mean, it is very, very good that this man had such an unusual dental pattern. A further 300 records were missing. Now, the men under these heights were excluded from the initial searches. That left 120 crewmen remaining, as identified by being between the ages of 21 and 35. Attempts to obtain nuclear DNA from the bones had failed because nuclear DNA is not good over the long term. It degrades very quickly and its signature does not last. However, mitochondrial DNA can be extracted from degraded bones that lack the nuclear DNA. And this is what's often used to solve a lot of old crimes. And it was extracted from one of the teeth from the body. So, Commander Greg Swindon, what a man. He is an HMAS Sydney tragic, but if it hasn't been for his dedication to this process, I'm sure that it would not have kept going over all these years. He looked through all the records of the men who would have worn boiler suits in the engine room, and this was the important starting point. But there were only 3 men out of those 120 possibles who met the criteria. Fortunately, relatives were found and mitochondrial DNA was tested. No match. So a wider net was cast to anyone who might have been wearing boiler suits. It could have been flight crew, could have been canteen staff. There were 13 men that could have been possibles for more boiler suits. The search for relatives went on. They were all found. Blow me down, not a match. That was absolutely soul destroying to find that out. We were really thought, oh no, where do we go from here? Greg then checked every photographic portrait he could lay his hands on from crew from Sydney to see if he could identify someone smiling with this gap tooth up on the right. But where do you go to next? You go to mitochondrial DNA. So what exactly are mitochondria? Okay, what do they do? Well, they're responsible for the breakdown of sugar and that it helps transport energy within our cells. So they're really a vital part of any cell. So you can see a cell structure here, you've got the nucleus, and DNA actually happens to be the main constituent of chromosomes. The chromosomes we get from our mum and dad, 23 from mum, 23 from dad, gives us 46 in the nucleus of the cell. But interestingly enough, mitochondria have DNA all of their own. So you can see the mitochondria here in the cell unit. Here's a closer drawing, and you can see the double helix DNA in the mitochondria here. And here is an electron microscope photograph of what an actual mitochondria looks like. So even though the little blighters are tiny, they are absolutely vital. So how do we look for people to be tested? Mitochondrial DNA only travels via the female line. Yeah, go girls. It doesn't travel through the men. So let's use this as an example. This came from the Cole Commission of Inquiry, this drawing. So let's say this is our target individual. Did he have a brother or a sister? Yes, he had a brother. The brother would have the same mitochondrial DNA as the missing man, but the brother would not pass the mitochondrial DNA on further. But the sister of the missing man, she would pass it on. She would pass it on to her brothers and her sisters and her sons and her daughters. Alas, her son would not pass it on, but her daughter, who was the niece of this target individual, would pass it on. She would pass it on to her daughter. She would also pass it on to her son, but he would not pass it on. So by tracing the females, bang, 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 here you are, all these generations forward. We know that this generation, which is the age of the unknown serviceman, the age of my father, who was also tested and not a match, they have all passed away. Their children would be my age, but I could not be tested because Dad did not pass mitochondrial DNA on. And I, unfortunately, I'm an only child, but Dad had a sister and Bernard had a sister. So Bernard's sister had passed it on to her children. So in actual fact, my female cousin could have been tested if Dad had had no children. What happens if there is no female in this line? What do you do? As I had to do in numerous cases, I went back to the mother. Did she have any sisters? Yes, she had a sister. That sister had the same mitochondrial DNA as the mother of the unidentified man. You then go and look at the sister. Did she have any female descendants? And bang, you've got a number of them here. The females are always shown in this circle. If the mother didn't have any brothers or sisters, you would even go further back to the grandmother and look at the grandmother. Did she have any other children or any sisters? And then you would start tracking it forward. Sounds complicated, but it's not really. You only always follow the female line to find a female relative. So as long as that female line exists, you're in business. The sad part about it is if there's no forward coming female line, then you can't get any mitochondrial DNA. So that target individual that you're looking for, he's out of the frame. So finding the crew relatives for testing can be difficult. Why is that? Because we're talking now third or fourth generations to be tested, and they may not be unaware at all that they have a relative aboard HMAS Sydney at all. Some families didn't talk about it. We know that at least 15 of the crew were adopted or orphans, and we also know that one man had assumed someone else's fake ID. We know that the DNA for this man is from a haplogroup J1. Now, a haplogroup is a group of people who share a common ancestor. That common ancestor, I have to tell you, could be 5,000 or 10,000 years in the past, but they all have that common ancestor. So if you think of the branches of a tree that could keep dividing out, you come to a division on a branch of a tree, and all the leaves hanging off that tree are what you would represent as a haplogroup. The mitochondrial DNA testing indicated he had blue-green eyes, light-coloured or red hair, and had Scottish, Irish ancestry. Unbelievably, there is a link to this man to another Sydney crew who was born in Glasgow, but that link is at least 5 generations back from the target individual. And as I've said before, there will be some cases where the female line no longer exists, and so there's nobody left for testing. But there were cases that we came across where families were unwilling to be tested. Some said, this is such a terribly open wound in my family, I don't want to discuss it, we don't want to talk about it. Others said their families were dysfunctional and they had nothing to do with other family members. Others felt that they did not want to know the name of the unknown serviceman, that he would represent, like the unknown soldier that is buried in cathedrals and war memorials around the world, that he would represent all the people aboard HMAS Sydney that had lost their lives. So now we also come to Y DNA. Y DNA, Y chromosomes are passed from father to son via the sex chromosomes, and it can be traced by the males through their patrilineal or male line. But Y DNA is extremely hard to extract over time. It actually diminishes over time, so therefore you can only use mDNA in degraded bones. But say someone is murdered on the street and their body is discovered and reported to police, Y DNA can be obtained, as well as mtDNA, from a body that has not been dead for very long. And there's been incredibly improved technology about Y DNA, because a lot of body parts from people from 9/11, some, I have to say, on the roofs of buildings many years later, were found, or in alleyways, and they were able to improve the technology of Y DNA and able to extract information as a result of all the work was done after 9/11. And we also know that if mitochondrial DNA gives a geological match, then you can use Y DNA to cross-check the result if it is obtainable from living male relatives. So if all of those things line up, and if mitochondrial DNA is found, and if unbelievably Y DNA could possibly be extracted and was found to be a match, then, who knows, the sky's the limit then. But you would need to be double checking your results before you could make any sort of announcements. So here is the long-standing procedure that is needed to be followed in these DNA matches that is done by Defence Force. You look at the cases of the men who were buried in mass graves in Fromelles, World War I, unidentified soldiers, or in fact World War II unidentified soldiers, or even Vietnam vets. This is the long-standing process by Defence. So you get a match with your initial samples. You take a second set of samples, and they are once again tested by the lab. If they are a match, then more samples are taken and sent to an alternate lab, so that therefore that would eliminate any mistakes within one laboratory only. If you had corroboration from 2 labs, your results would certainly withstand any scrutiny. If possible, then you try and obtain Y DNA for testing, once again as a dotting the I and crossing the T of what you've already found from your mitochondrial DNA tests. If that was also found to be a match, then all the evidence is completely reviewed by an internal panel to make sure that there have been no mistakes. If that evidence is then if that evidence stands up, a board is convened by Defence, where everything, every minute detail, procedures and evidence has to be presented to that board. If the board, after they've gone away and done all their deliberations and looked and gone through everything with a fine-tooth comb, if the board approves the findings, then the Commonwealth War Graves Commission is involved, because this could be a headstone for a man in Fromelles that is showing as an unknown serviceman. And then once this is done, family members are notified. This has been a long-standing process over many, many years. So what happened at Christmas Island in 2020? Australian Defence Force personnel were working on the site because they had been stationed there. So Sub-Lieutenant Mika Brooks took it upon herself to take some of her colleagues from both the Navy and the Army. They tidied up the site. They did a terrific job, And here is the plaque that has been installed on the site of the grave of the unknown serviceman that recognises HMAS Sydney and also recognises the site being that of the grave of the unknown serviceman. And here is Sub-Lieutenant Mika Brooks here. So I think it's really lovely to think that, several branches of the Defence Force were involved in that task of cleaning up the site on Christmas Island. So with that, I'll stop screen sharing and I will throw the open for questions.
I thought that was an excellent presentation. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did.
Nigel, did you have a question?
From the research I've done, was it possibly a chief petty officer ultimately in the engine room by the name of Norman Foster?
There were no rank badges on the body, so who knows who it is? I mean, I think something to remember here is, imagine if that body had floated past Christmas Island in the dead of night. We wouldn't be having this discussion. There'd be no media talk about an identification. It probably would have washed up in Indonesia, which was then under Japanese control, would have all been a non-event. So that fact that body in that raft was sighted by those coast watchers was hugely important in what we are all talking about all these years later.
A question about the distance that the body had gone from the scene of the battle to the island. I think you said 2,600 kilometres. Is that realistic?
No, sorry, Norm, it was 1,800 kilometres from the site of the Sydney wreck. Sydney sank in 2,468 metres of water.
So has that been tested at all, the drift from that site to the island to check that that was feasible?
Well, I would presume so. It wouldn't have. I don't really know whether anyone would have gone into drift to an in-depth drift analysis, but they just know that it was 1,800 metres, 1,800 kilometres from the site of Sydney's wreck, northwest. Virtually on top, it almost was on its way to Indonesia.
Gillian, you mentioned the Y DNA. Was that a factor in the final identification, or was there no way to connect the body with anyone else?
I'm not here to comment on any. I'm only saying that if you find you get a match, then the next step is that you try and get a Y DNA sample to substantiate the matches that you already have, if that is possible.
Yep.
In anybody, whether you're talking about someone from L, or whether you're talking about the unknown serviceman, that would apply across the board as standard Navy procedure.
Okay.
Or defence procedure.
I think we need to wait until Friday to find out. I'm sure it has provoked all of your curiosity, but I think we just need to be patient and wait till Friday to find out what the announcement is.
Anyone else have a question? Well, I guess we're done then.
So now that you know all the work that was done, you, I'm sure, will be interested to hear the announcement, and maybe you can think about what was done to get to that point of announcement. So thank you all for attending.